Welcome to Generations, a show which helps people 50 and better lead happy, healthy, and productive lives. Here's today's moderator, Gloria Van Dummeltrot.
Hello and welcome to Generations. My name is Gloria Van Dummeltrot and I'll be your moderator today. We have a terrific guest and I think we're going to have a lot of fun talking about baseball. First, I'll introduce our co-hosts. Today we have Jeff DeZeller. Welcome, Jeff.
Well, thank you, Gloria. Pleased to be here.
Great to have you. Our second co-host is Bruce Tyler. Bruce, we're delighted to have you with us today. And
Thank you.
I have to tell a personal story. This is it. Bruce is actually my brother, fellas. I don't know if you know this. And he is such a lover of baseball. When his first child was born, his only child, he called me and said, "Gloria, we have a son. I'm already training him." And I said, "Training him in what?" And he said, I whisper in his ear, "Run fast, turn left." And he plays baseball, right?
Oh, yes.
Our next co-host is Bob Johnston. Bob, we're happy to have you here today.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Wonderful. And our guest today is Frank White. Welcome, Frank. We're so happy to have you today with us.
Gloria, thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Frank is a former Recreation Center Director and Community Education Coordinator for the City of St. Paul. Quite a title. And he has also written a wonderful book called They Played for the Love of the Game, Untold Stories of Black Baseball in Minnesota.
Yeah.
Wonderful. We're excited to hear about it, and we'll all be asking you questions and talking about it. Frank, can you tell us a little bit maybe about your background or how you did that?
Well, my background is that I love my father. He was my hero, and I had many opportunities to travel with him and watch him play sports, in this case specifically baseball. So as I grew in my journey, I found out that he was actually recruited by Buck O'Neill and the Kansas City Monarchs. Never knew that until I was an adult. And then also that as teams used to barnstorm through, the Negro League teams used to barnstorm through Minnesota, they actually used to come and get him to play with them. So that kind of piqued my interest. I've always been a person that loved history, and so this just seemed to me something to do. I actually started with an exhibit with Ramsey County Historic Society, and then they suggested that I do some writing. I still don't consider myself a writer. I think I'm a storyteller. So that's kind of at least the beginning on how I pursued or was pushed to write the book.
Back in their 30s, 40s, 50s, when their town teams were really strong in the state of Minnesota, and a lot of them did unscrupulous things to get the better of another town, and they would recruit people to play for them. And I know that a number of black baseball players were recruited, and I was wondering, how did they do the recruitment and get them to come up to Minnesota?
You know, I'm not actually sure of every story, but John Donaldson was a great pitcher, and I'm not sure how they initially got in touch with him. Although I will share that, you know, back at before the turn of the century, the late 19th century, here in St. Paul in Minnesota, or St. Paul, Minneapolis, there were 6 trains that went to Chicago on a daily basis. Oh. And at the time, African Americans were porters. And so they became a great source of communication. And I believe that's how, again, the link to baseball players as they traveled into Chicago. People knew that people were looking for ball players, or ball players were looking for teams. So I know John Donaldson has played for a number of town teams and was paid very well because he was a great pitcher. In fact, there's a gentleman named Peter Gordon that is pursuing to try to get John Donaldson into the Hall of Fame. He's that good. So, so that's a little beginning, and I think from there, as more people came into Minnesota, obviously word spread that teams were looking for people to play. Back in the 30s, the 40s, the 20s, we like all of the country had segregated baseball. Although again, there were some towns that brought in an individual to help their team do a better job, and I've heard stories, and I went down to Slayton and talked about John Donaldson and how thousands of people would come to watch him down in, I think he played for a team called Lissamore. And so it's interesting to me. I said, well, how did all those people get there? And some went by train, some went by horse and buggy, and if they were fortunate to have a car, they did that too. So that's a little bit of the story of how it's not the complete story, because I don't know all of the ways. But again, that communication had to have happened along the train routes, the guys that were porters. And sometimes people would find out and they would send letters to a town to say, I'm looking for this ball player, and then make an offer.
Frank, I haven't read your book, although I'm sincerely looking forward to doing it. I'm going to order it when we get done with the show. But it appears from your website and from the materials that I looked at that you basically shed a light on something that really very few people would have known anything about. And my question is, what sort of personal satisfaction does that give you? Because your effort was what brought this to light, and it would have been probably, it would have died if you yourself or somebody else hadn't done that. And what sort of satisfaction does that give you, particularly with the connection with your father?
I don't know that I can really describe that other than to say it's for sure a huge feeling of success. The book has done very well. I think it's in its third printing, and I've been to a number of places to talk, so I think people are interested in the story. And I think you're correct in that I've been in a fortunate situation to be with my father, to watch him, to know some of his friends. And after my father passed away and I found out more stories, I was able to interview some of his friends that played with him. And clearly, those stories are not documented anywhere in our history. So I think it's an untold story. Thus the title of the book, and it's a story that's worthy of being told, because a number of these guys were great baseball players, but couldn't play at a higher level because of segregated baseball that we had even here in Minnesota. You know, we have a great state here, the North Star State, and I think people feel that those kinds of things happened in the South, but they actually happened here. We had covenants of where you could live, where you couldn't live. You couldn't stay in hotels in downtown St. Paul and Minneapolis. You couldn't eat in restaurants, certain restaurants. So I think there's a lot of that history that people just aren't aware of, and every time I share that, they kind of shake their heads because it's not told anywhere else. So for that part, I feel very happy and grateful that maybe the gentlemen that I've talked to and the women that I've talked to that have recounted some of those stories is now maybe documented history. And I think that's important for all of us.
Absolutely important. Thank you for doing that. For when we know about something, we can stop it from happening again. And that's true about history, all of history. Tell me, please, what was the most exciting thing that you uncovered in these untold stories? There had to have been one story that you either researched or heard that was just really thrilling to your core.
I think one of the most interesting was I talked out in Burnsville at the library out there, and I was doing a tour on my exhibit at the time, and before before we started, a gentleman came up and said, "Can I show you something?" And he, out of a plastic bag, he took this old scorebook. It had broadcloth covering, a hard covering, different than what we have today. Excuse me. And when he opened it up, all of the pages were yellowed and tattered on the edges. And it was his father's scorebook from the 20s. Oh. His father's team was called Oxborough Hearth. Heath in the Bloomington area. There is an Oxbow area today, the Oxbow Library, that type of stuff. And so he pointed in the scorebook, and the number 3 batter his name was White. And I looked at it, and he said, "Is that your father?" And I looked at the position. It was left field. I looked at the date. I said, "When is this from?" And that particular game was from May 29th, 1927. And I said, "Well, that couldn't be my father because he was born on February 29th, 1928. But during the course of my presentation, my talk, all of a sudden it came to me, it was George White, who was the coach of my father's team later on. So that scorebook, I said, I pointed to him, I said, "Can I talk to you after the presentation?" I did. He and his wife invited me to their home. I would later find out that his father was the gentleman that owned all of the land. He called him a truck farmer, owned all of the land that Met Center was built on. Met Stadium was built on. So his father was a lover of baseball, lover of working on the ground, and so he actually became, when the organization bought the land, he actually got hired to be the assistant groundskeeper at Met Stadium. And so he said his dad was at the best of both worlds. He got baseball and he got to work on the ground. So I think that's one of those stories. And the gentleman, Lyle Gerhardt, and his wife is Juanita, actually allowed me to take that scorebook home. And going through the whole book, I found 7 games where his father's team played a team called the Uptown Sanitary Shop, which was an independent team out of St. Paul, all black, and then a team called Potts Motor Company from Minneapolis. So his father's team, over a stretch of probably 8 years, had played this team 7 different times. So I actually have copies of those original score sheets from the 20s. So each one of those games, both sides of the lineup, are individual pieces of history. So that's one of those wow moments in research that you just come across, and it's just unbelievable. The names in the score sheets. One of them was Lee, Jimmy Lee, who the recreation center here in St. Paul is named after. And I knew Jimmy, and great sports official, great baseball player, great golfer, and people now know more of that story. So he was the first black baseball umpire in the Big Ten. So again, it's a way to connect a lot of dots. So.
I saw a video on your website about a woman named Tony Stone, I believe it was, the first African American, although that wasn't the term that was used then,
Right.
but first African American woman to play professional baseball. How unbelievable is that? I mean, were there other people that did that too, or she was a trailblazer, or was she the only one? I mean, just the story seems so exceptional to me.
There are some pictures that go back even further. So women did play baseball, although it was her favorite game in the stories that have been told about her. There is a book called Curveball that has been done on Tony Stone. We just had her niece in town for the Saints. We did an honoring of her this past season, and so I've been able to learn a lot about her. But I think that here was a woman that wanted to play baseball. She played other sports. I've got a picture of her in a football uniform, and but she wanted to play baseball. Baseball was her love, no different than Bruce, and unfortunately, she couldn't get that opportunity to play because there weren't women's teams, and some men didn't want her to play. And although she could play, I think in the Negro Leagues when she played for the Indianapolis Clowns her first year, I think she hit somewhere around, the records say around 220, 230, maybe even as high as 260, because all of the documentation wasn't kept at the time because it wasn't always turned in for the game. So there is some speculation that she hit as high as 260 in the Negro Leagues. And the Negro Leagues had some very good players and pitchers, so she did well. And but like in professional sports today, you know, if you're one of the players that's always on the cusp, you know, I think a lot of guys probably didn't want her to play because that meant somebody was going to lose a job. So, and some people, Buck O'Neill, famous person and ambassador of the Negro Leagues and a star in his own right, probably should be in the Hall of Fame. Connected and manager of the Kansas City Monarchs. When she was traded to the Monarchs, he didn't play her that much, and thus she ended up leaving because Buck felt that women should be in the kitchen. So I love Buck, but that part of me is a little suspect, but he was a great individual. So
Willie Mays was not allowed to stay in the same hotel as his teammates until 1964, which is unbelievable, but yet it happened. What were some of the acceptance issues that black players had to endure in Minnesota during these early times?
It was pretty much the same way when Willie actually came here to play with the Millers. He actually stayed in a home on 4th Street or 4th Avenue in South Minneapolis, and he did that because Dave Barndale and a couple of other guys lived across the street in an area where African Americans were allowed to live again. Because there was a time when in Minneapolis, Negroes, African Americans, blacks couldn't live south of 42nd. When Roy Campanella came here to play with the St. Paul Saints in 1948, Willie would come in 51. Roy Campanella lived on Rondo Avenue in St. Paul, again an accepted area where African Americans could live. But I think the same story, in fact, you know, into the mid-60s, the Twins organization, when they went to Florida, they still had segregated circumstances. Earl Batty would have to go live in the Negro League, or excuse me, the Negro section of town. And a lot of people don't know that. But it wasn't only the Twins. And it wasn't necessarily the Twins organization. Those were the conditions in Florida for spring training. And so here in Minnesota, we had some of the same situations. I think earlier I mentioned that, you know, Negroes, African Americans, blacks couldn't stay in first-class hotels in downtown St. Paul or Minneapolis. So not only when ball players came, but also entertainers would come. The Mills Brothers or whatever, they would stay at a place called Phyllis Wheatley in Minneapolis because on the 3rd floor, they had sleeping rooms like the YMCA. And Phyllis Wheatley was a community center for African Americans, similar to Brown here in St. Paul. So those conditions existed. And when people would venture out to, you know, where they were going to live, pretty much they would go to a place where they were accepted, which here in St. Paul was the Rondo area. Again, here in Minnesota, we had segregated baseball, and to a certain degree, we had places where you were accepted to live, and that was the only place. So, hope that answers the question. So,
Thank you.
I see in your biography, well, in your story, that you coordinate some programs now with the Minnesota Twins. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I've just finished my 17th season of coordinating the RBI program, which is Reviving Baseball in Inner Cities. It's a program that was started by a gentleman named John Young out in LA. Major League Baseball adopted it, and it's an effort to increase the number of African Americans playing baseball. However, as the program has come forward, it's expanded beyond that. Here in the Twin Cities, you know, we currently probably have more kids of color playing baseball than we have for a long time. People don't know that. But if you sign up for Minneapolis Park and Rec or St. Paul Park and Rec, you're a part of the RBI program. So right now we probably have 4,000 or 5,000 kids playing baseball and softball each season, they're not all African American. So it's an opportunity, again, to play the game. It started out with that intent. And there are over 200 programs in the country and also in the Caribbean. This past year we hosted the World Series, again for the 4th time, and we may have an opportunity to do that next year. So teams come from all over the country and even the Caribbean to play in the RBI World Series. Very similar to the Little League World Series. So it's been enjoyable for me. I've got to meet a lot of people. I've got to see kids grow up. And if you can imagine, 17 years, if they were 17 when they were playing, they're now in their mid-30s. And so I still have people come up to me all the time and call me coach. And every season I'm out at a ballpark probably 3 or 4 times a week watching ball games. And I tell my friend, Steve Winfield, who's like my brother, Dave Winfield and Steve Winfield, they're like my brothers. So I always tell Steve, I'm going to go out and shake hands and kiss babies tonight. So, and that's what I do. I mean, I go out and I interact with parents while they're watching the game and ask them how they enjoy, if they enjoy our program, what their thoughts are. So it gives me an opportunity to get feedback immediately. And obviously I get to interact with the kids too. So I enjoy that.
So Frank, the African Americans were not given the opportunity to play in the big leagues until, I guess, 1947. Yet there were a lot of super players, high quality players. It seems like it's kind of obvious in hindsight because now the majors is chock full of fabulous players of color. But and I know that like Satchel Paige, for example, I guess is in the Hall of Fame. My question is, what's the mechanism for getting people from the Negro Leagues or the barnstorming or what have you that never got a chance to play in the majors? Is there a mechanism to get them into the Hall of Fame, the Cooperstown Hall of Fame, even though they were never given that opportunity just based on their performance where they did have the opportunity?
Well, there was and I don't remember exactly what the committee called them, but for lack of a better term, I would say they were the pioneer players or whatever, that segment. And I think a number of players that were in the Negro Leagues got in through that method. Although in 2006, now I could be wrong on the year, but they inducted 16 individuals that were connected to the Negro Leagues. And I'm because that's the year Buck O'Neil didn't get in, but they said that would be the last group of those potential Negro League players or managers or owners that would get into the Negro Leagues. And I think they're re-looking at that today. And that would be unfortunate. We were earlier talking about maybe a fourth individual making it from St. Paul into the Hall of Fame. But there are some additional players in the Negro Leagues that for sure should be looked at. Buck O'Neil is one of those, and he didn't make it in that particular group. So let's hope that the Hall of Fame organization will take another look, and that won't be the last group. But that was the method for players that didn't play in the major leagues to get in. Yeah. And so there were some individuals that made it in through that method, but that method no longer exists.
Yeah, just the way you said, they say, brought me back to the 30s, even though I wasn't born there. How often these people must have heard that. They say you can't do this. Mm-hmm. They say do something else. They say go somewhere else, and it just, hopefully it's in the past.
Yeah. And let's hope, and I think, you shared earlier that, our history is important, so maybe we don't repeat things. Mm-hmm. But I also believe that it's important for you just to know what history is, and for all of us, and how that may impact others. I mean, we're at a time right now in our country where things seem to be divided more than they have been in the past. And I think hopefully we'll all take a look at that individually and avoid some of those situations that may not recognize other individuals in the way they should be.
That we've already been through.
Right, exactly.
Where do you see the future of baseball now going? We've got so many sports now. We have national soccer leagues, which we didn't used to have. What's happening? Baseball, I love baseball. It's the only sport I really understand, but it's so terrific. What's the future of baseball?
Oh, I think baseball is it's still our national pastime. You can say that Dallas Cowboys are the national team, if that's what you want to say. You can say football is, basketball is, but baseball is really our game. And if you look at just the pure numbers, the number of teams, the size of stadiums, the number of games played, the number of games played on TV, on radio, baseball is probably our anchor. Well, not probably, it's our anchor.
It's our
And football, you know, football is got a major challenge right now with what's going on in reducing numbers of because of concussions and all of the things that brings at the younger levels. So there's some questions that maybe remain in front for football. I think baseball needs to maybe speed up the game because at the major league level, you know, they've got to do a certain amount of commercials and all of those kinds of things because it's money.
Yeah.
But the game gets to be pretty long, and at times, we tell kids today. I shared this earlier when we were talking. Kids think baseball is boring, and it's a game where there's a lot of standing around, and thus at our youth level, sometimes kids are maybe choosing other sports because the perception is it is boring. So we've got to do some things to speed up the game and some
But it's
some
still our
teaching things.
national sport.
For me, I think it's our national sport.
I think for lots of other people. Thank you so much, Frank, for being here. This has been a delightful show. We really appreciate having you here.
Gloria, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You are welcome. Thank you, co-host Jeff DeZeller. Thank you so much for being with us. And Bruce, we enjoyed having you.
Thank you.
Bob Johnston, thank you so much for being with us,
great.
too. This was a fun show.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for watching Generations. We hope to see you next time.
Casey was baseball mad, had the fever and had it bad. Just to root for the hometown crew every Sue. Casey Blue. On a Saturday, her young beau called to see if she'd like to go to see a show, but Miss Kate said no. I'll tell you what you can do. Take me out to the ball game. Take me out with the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and cracker jack. I don't care if I never get back.